Okay, great. Awesome. All right. So I just want to again thank the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union for helping facilitate this, and the Colorado Grain Chain. I was the founding chair of the Colorado Grain Chain, and I'm a business member as the Grain Lady. So the Colorado Grain Chain, this is the first in a series of offerings we'll have around using whole heritage grains. And that is evolving. So this is a free class for everybody, but I would encourage you to become members of the Colorado Grain Chain now more important than ever as we mobilize and really push forward to create this local grain economy. And you can also donate if you'd like for this class. So you can find all that on the Colorado Grain Chain's website. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Mona. I'm known as the Grain Lady. And I have been working with the local grain movement for the past 4 years. And as the Grain Lady, I do a lot of education and workshops around using whole heritage grains. So let me I'm going to video this. Hang on, let me hop up real quick. That's the other thing. We are going to be recording today, so I hope that's okay with everybody. If not, just send Dan a quick message or put it up in the chat. I'm going to hop up for 1 second and turn on my video. Okay, great. I'm back. Okay, so let's see. So if you need to learn more about me, you can go to my website, thegrainlady.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at Mona the Grain Lady. But now I want to dive right into sourdough starters. And what I won't be doing today is actually going step by step on how to build a sourdough starter, or how I do want to go, and I want to go in depth into how you feed your starter and what the variables are that affect the health of your starter, and how you can take charge of your own starter so it doesn't take over your life, so you can have a reasonable schedule and you can have a real understanding of how the starter works. But I will go over some of the supplies you'll need to start your own starter, or once you have a starter, what you'll need to keep it going. So I just have a few things in front of me, and I'll just go over them real quick. A digital scale, super important. There is a little bit of science in keeping a sourdough starter, so it's really important to have a scale so you can be accurate in your measurements. And then you'll need a container to keep your starter in. You can use a glass quart jar, or I love these Cambros, these 1 liter Cambros, because the mouth is so wide. It's so much easier to get your hand in there. This looks wide enough until you start like trying to get your hand in there. This is great. You can really, and it cleans a lot more easily. Dried little bits of starter are harder to get off the glass than this. So these you can find online or in a restaurant supply store locally if you have one of those. And then the next thing you'll need is something to stir your starter with. I really love these flexible rubber spatulas, because when you are stirring your starter, you really want to get in there and like whip it up. So you introduce some oxygen in the very beginning and make sure all the flour is integrated into the water, okay? And then we'll go into detail more, but why? Because temperature is one of the important variables in your starter. It's great to have a little thermometer that you can stick in your water to measure the water temperature, and as well as your starter. And then I also like to have just an ambient thermometer so I know what the temperature is in wherever I'm keeping my starter. Because a lot of recipes you'll see things like, and keep your starter at room temperature. Well, room temperature in your house is going to be different in my house. And room temperature in one corner of my kitchen is going to be different than in another corner of my kitchen. So this is just a good way to get a sense of what that variable is. So there are lots of great recipes for getting started and resources for building your own starter. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of those right now. This is a great book, The Sourdough School by Vanessa Kimball. The Whole Grain Connection with Monica Spiller. Her website is another terrific resource. Baker's Hands, a lot going on Instagram right now, which is why I'm not going to take the time today to go over building a starter. There's so many great resources right now. So Baker's Hands, that's Tara Jensen. She's on Instagram. She also has a great website. If you sign up for her newsletter, she has a great newsletter. Same with Sourdough School. All these folks are sending out fantastic newsletters weekly about baking and sourdough starters and everything that's going on. I'd also recommend Tartine. It's a great book. The first one has a lot of great pictures, which is awesome. And what else? Online, Maurizio, The Perfect Loaf. That's an excellent resource for recipes for starting your own starter, feeding your starter, frequently asked questions about your starter. And he's on Instagram as well. Okay, so now, first I want to talk just briefly about why you would want a sourdough starter and what the benefits are. So a sourdough starter is when you ferment grains, anything, your bread, your pasta, your pastry dough, your cookies. Long and slow is the key. And that is how a sourdough starter ferments. It's a long and slow process that increases digestibility. It makes the vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants in the grains more bioavailable. And as an added bonus, it increases flavor. So those are just a few of the benefits. I'm not going to go into the science part of it. There's, like I said, there's a lot of great material that you can read about what's going on with the bacteria and the wild yeast and what's going on with your gut when you have more time to do that. So now I want to talk about, now you have your starter. You either built it yourself, or in my opinion, the best way to do it is to get it from somebody who already has an active starter. If you have a baker or a friend, if you're in Boulder, you can get some from me, because every time you feed your starter, you discard a certain portion of it, okay? And you can always share that with friends. And we'll talk about at the end also what you can do with the extra starter that you need to discard. All right, so just quickly back to the supplies. I wasn't quite done. The other thing, so these are the vessels that you need, and you'll also need flour. And so I use a 100% whole wheat. I use turkey red flour and for my starter, because the more whole grain I can get into things, the better. And I say that sort of facetiously because everything is whole grain for me. I don't use any white flour. The nutritional benefits, the fiber, it's all so important. And there's more activity in a whole grain starter, because a lot of the yeast and the bacteria are actually on the kernel. So that's why a whole wheat starter moves a little faster than a white starter. So what's important about that, whatever you choose, be consistent, because your starter really needs consistency. And that's, something, a point to drive home when we're talking about how you train your starter. You really want to give your starter the same flour consistently, and you want to feed it on a regular schedule within reason. And so let's look, actually, are there any questions coming up?
Looks like Denise Stober has a question. At the end, could you discuss drying or freezing the discard as a backup?
Oh, Diane, maybe. I think I can. You probably know better how to do that than I do because you've done it. But yes, we'll talk about that. Okay, great. So let's talk about this concept of once you have your starter, of feeding your starter. Basically, when you feed your starter, it's just flour, water, and a percentage of the starter that you have going. So if you look at, I'm gonna put this up here. Here is a recipe for feeding your starter. So you would feed your starter equal amounts flour and water and a certain percentage of starter. And we're gonna talk about what the variables are that influence how often, you can't see that, can you? How often you feed your starter. So what happens with the starter is, here I actually have, my starter here from this morning that I fed, and I fed it at around 7. And so it's not, it's not doing too much right now. But it will over time. And so what happens with the starter is that you give it all these bacteria and yeasts in the air and on your hands and on the grains that help it to form, that are food for the starter. And so over a period of time, your starter will rise and you'll see lots of bubbles, and it'll form this nice dome. And at a certain point, it won't have any more food left to eat. And so the dome will start to go down. So the real trick is figuring out, so you want to feed your starter when it has reached its peak or it's just starting to come down. So how do you figure out how long that's going to take, and how can you control that so that you're not a slave to your starter and you're not having to feed it 2, 3, 4 times a day? So one way to do that, there are a couple ways to do that. One is by controlling the temperature, and the other is by controlling how much, this number here, starter, that you use as your seed for feeding your starter. So the general idea is that when it's colder, your starter moves more slowly. When it's warmer, it moves quicker. So if in an ideal situation, you could, and if you had all the time in the world, or if you were in a bakery, you would be able to feed your starter whenever it rose and was starting to come down. But what you want to do is make that manageable so that more or less you are feeding your starter at 10 to 12 hour intervals, which would make sense for your lifestyle. So you wake up in the morning, let's say every morning you wake up, and before you do, or whatever works for your lifestyle, before you have your breakfast, while you're making your coffee, you go ahead and you feed your starter. Let's say that's at 7 a.m. in the morning. Ideally, I would like my starter to reach its peak or around that time in 12 hours, so that I have this regular interval that fits with my lifestyle, so that at 7 p.m. I would feed my starter again. So the way to have that nice long stretch of time be viable is to keep your starter in a cooler location in your home, and to use a smaller seed percentage. So in a lot of different recipes, you'll see that this number varies. Sometimes it's 15 grams, sometimes it's 20 grams. The smaller the seed percentage, and it's percentage related to the flour, So I use this is actually my recipe, but it's also a nice even base 10 number that you can divide your percentages. So 15% is 15 grams of the flour amount of 100. So in the summertime, when it's really hot in my kitchen and I can't find a cool spot, I will drop my seed percentage down to 10%. And basically what you have to do in your own homes, in your own kitchens, is to observe what's happening with your starter. Maybe your home is warmer than mine, or maybe it's much colder, so you don't have to drop it down. And I would say 10% is a number that is the number I'm comfortable dropping it down. Anything below that, I start to worry about there being enough activity. So, and then in the winter time, if things are moving slowly because it's cold, you can bump it up a little. So this is just a nice thing you can do on your own. You can experiment with how much of this seed percentage you use in your starter, how it correlates to how fast things are moving in your home based on the temperatures. Okay, but you really want it to go in that window unless you want to be feeding your starter more than twice a day. If you're up in the middle of the night or whatever your lifestyle is, you can do that. But the idea is to be consistent and to be giving your starter food when it needs it, before it gets too exhausted, because then different kinds of acids start to develop and it affects flavor and it affects performance. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I see a lot of questions. Are there any questions coming in, Dan, that, let me see.
Yeah. So we've had a number of ones that folks have actually answered for each other within the chat box, but there was a question of just asking again what kind of flour you used, and you said 100% whole wheat turkey red flour. The name of the wide mouth container, and that's called a Cambro.
Right.
The gentleman's name on Instagram that you mentioned, and that was the Perfect Loaf by Maurizio. Diane asked, what temps are triggers for dropping it down to? As far as, what temperature do you kind of look at as far as dropping your starter down, like in the summer when it's extra warm for you?
Sure. So in the summer, you can control, it's hard to control the temperature in your home. So you try to find the coolest spot. So for example, in my house, let's just take the winter time, right? In the winter time, let's say in my kitchen, it's maybe 60 to 65, maybe a little bit higher on a bake day, or if the oven's on, or on a mixed day when I'm trying to keep the house a little bit warmer. But overnight, definitely in the 60 range. So with that temperature, with that temperature, and then I go down, I'm at 10% because that actually seems to work even in the winter for me. Then it takes about 12 hours for my starter to need to be fed again, maybe even a little bit less than that. And so in the summertime, and I even use cold water because that's actually a pretty long stretch of time, 12 hours. So in the summertime, you would just do the same things. You would try to find a cooler spot, in the 60s somewhere, drop it down to 10 grams rather than 15 grams, and use cold water when you feed your starter. And then just keep an eye on it.
Oh, great.
And, at a certain point, there's only so much you can do in terms of, changing the temperature in your home. Diane, does that make sense? Okay.
Great. And then one more question. Katie asks, how will we know when it's peaked? You mentioned a dome.
Yeah, so so I like to keep rubber bands on my containers. And so when I feed my my starter in the morning. It's usually like down to here. I guess I could use the one. With this quantity, you don't see the rise as much. When you have a larger quantity of flour and water, you really will see that your starter, so this is one visual cue, your starter will increase by about 50%. Other cues to look for is when you look inside, it really, instead of being flat, you really do see a little dome that starts to happen. And you'll see bubbles both on the outside and up on the top is the gas CO2 bubbles. And in addition to that, you can smell the starter. So when your starter is healthy and it's at its peak, it has a nice sweet smell to it. So you really have to get to know your starter. With all of us home a lot more, this is a good chance to really check in and see what's happening throughout the day. And so you'll know, so you'll see this nice little dome, and then if you miss the dome, you'll know when the dome has started to come down, because you'll start to see it kind of caving in on itself, and you'll see bubbles. And the other thing I kind of forgot to mention is I always keep my lid just slightly ajar. I don't even think you really need a lid. It's just to keep other stuff from going in there, but I always keep a little bit open so that the CO2 can escape while you're starting doing its thing.
Great. And a question from Jane. What is the float test, and will you show it?
Oh, the float test. I can't remember where the float test is one of those things that used to make me so stressed out, because, so the float test is it can be one way to see if your starter is full of enough gas bubbles and structure to be ready to use in baking, or to be ready to feed. Those are kind of happen at the same, those are the same things. But it doesn't always work. And it doesn't, I can't remember, I just read this recently. There's something about whole grain flour and starter where the float test doesn't really work. But basically what it is, you take a small quantity, like a teaspoon of your starter, and you carefully float it in, drop it in the water and see if it floats. Mm. But it's much better to use your visual senses, your smell, and just what you know from observing your starter to know if it's ready to bake with. And that's kind of another okay, I'll tap into this really quickly. So there might be some questions about, okay, so this is the starter. I'm feeding my starter every, twice a day, and this is the schedule I want to be on so I can maintain it. But what about when I want to actually use it for baking bread? So basically, you're getting your starter on this routine, and you're training it to be as strong as it can be and ready to go. It's kind of you want your starter to be well fed and happy when you're ready to use it. And so let's say, so sometimes you'll see other words for starter, like the leavon. There's lots of people use a lot of different words. I like to call my starter, the one that I feed every day, my starter. And when I bake bread, it's not really a special starter per se, but it is, I call it my leavon because it's the starter that I'm going to use that day to bake. And I want to make sure that it's critical that it has reached its peak, and it has all those characteristics we were talking about, the dome, the bubbles, it smells, has this nice milky smell, that it's ready to work to get more food to create the gluten structure necessary to make bread, right? And so I don't want that to be a guessing game. I actually really want to control that. So this is a good example of how controlling the temperature, either of your space or the water, will influence how long it takes your starter to be ready. So I usually work backwards. so that this can fit into my life. So let's say that I want, and this is kind of the scientific part where you have to do a little trial and error, and where you get to use your room temperature and your thermometer to make sure you have all this consistency, and you take a bunch of notes so you can see what works. So if I want to bake at 11, I know that if my starter is kept at around 78 degrees on my leavon that I'm going to use in the bread, it'll take about three and a half hours to form that dome and to be ready to use to bake. And so I get to that 78 degree temperature by controlling the temperature of my water that I use to create the leavon. And also by putting it in a warm place that is around 78 degrees. And so what I do, I think you can see my coffee machine over there in the back. I just leave my coffee machine on, and I don't put it, that's the warmest place I have. I don't put it directly on top of the heating thing. I put it on top of those little cups, so it has some circulation, and that's the warm spot I have. You can also turn your oven on, not the oven light, and warm that up in the morning. That could be a place for you. So that, that's also trial and error. Once you systematize that, you can actually leave and not miss you can leave your house, and not miss the window of when your starter is ready. So, but that takes some observation. That takes putting the rubber band on, watching it rise, checking on it, taking the temperature of actually, putting this in and taking the temperature of your starter, and monitoring those kinds of factors. So that's one thing you can do. And I also use more starter to make things go faster when I build my leavon. Okay, I feel like that's a lot of information. Should we take a little break? I want to make sure it's clear about how time is affected by the percentage of starter that you use, and the temperature in your home, and the temperature of the water, and also the kind of flour that you use, because whole grain moves faster. So maybe this is a good stopping point. I can look through, I'll scroll down the chat. Okay. And we can take, okay, actually, Dan, do you want to read the questions? It's hard to do that and be on here at the same time.
Sure, yeah, of course. Christina was asking, can you explain how to tell if you accidentally killed your sourdough starter, and then also that she has read that you can keep it in the fridge and feed it once a week if you aren't cooking daily. Just wondering if that was true.
Yep. Okay, so Christina, you can unmute yourself if you want. Hi. Is this a starter that you've had for a while, or you're creating a new starter?
It is a starter that I picked up from Moxie's 2 days ago.
Okay.
And I fed it the first time, and it was beautiful and bubbly. And then I took out the amount that the internet told me, and then I baked bread with it, and then I gave it new flour and water, and now it does not look the same, and it looks not good.
Okay. So my guess is it's because new flour, meaning a different type of flour?
Well, I use the same type of flour. I was just feeding it with all-purpose flour because that's what I have. Can you wait a minute? And there, you can say hi. And
It's probably have to get used to the flour using.
Okay, so even though it's the same flour I fed it with the second time, it still just might not be used to it.
Yeah, and it's different than what Andy was probably feeding it. So you probably saw a little surge of activity, and now there won't be. So it doesn't mean that you've killed the starter.
Okay.
You just need to establish your routine and be consistent. And all-purpose flour is just not as strong as
Well, then,
other flours. So
I
it just
put it with all the
be as
response
active.
and switch now because I am getting some turkey wheat delivered today.
Mhm.
And then I
Yep.
just- yeah.
I would do that. If you know you're going to have a bunch of turkey red for a while, that's what I would do.
Okay.
Just be patient. It's pretty hard to kill a starter. That's the other thing. They're pretty resilient.
I'm gonna
So
put
just eating it and get on a regular schedule, and you should be okay.
okay.
All right.
Okay, maybe I should address the fridge question. So for those of you that don't bake every day or twice a week or any quantity like that, there's really no reason to keep your starter out and feed it every day. What you do need to do is when you are going to use it, you have to get it sort of amped up again. So you can put it in the fridge in between, but you need to take it out and feed it at least 2 days, twice a day, and observe it and make sure it's rising and falling predictably and you see bubbles and it smells good so you know that it's active and ready to use to bake. So all that requires, it's a little less on the fly flexibility, right? You can't just be like, I'm gonna bake tomorrow. You're gonna be like, oh, I want to bake tomorrow, but my starter's in the fridge. So you just have to think ahead to when you want to use it and take it out 2 days and get it back in training again before you use it. The bonus to that is you're not discarding so much starter every day. But I bake twice a week. I use my starter in all kinds of things. I use it in recipes like waffles and pancakes. I use it to make pasta that I ferment overnight. I use it for pastry dough. You can throw a lot of starter in quick breads like banana bread and things like that. And so it really just depends how much you're using it. It's really hard to use up all your discarded starter unless you're just baking pancakes like every day. But it's you can feel you are going to have to compost some of your starter. I was trying to think of a parallel to that, to not have the guilt of discarding starter, and maybe making coffee could be a similar parallel. So you have to you grind the beans, you make the coffee, you have to discard the grounds when you're done. You can put them in your garden, you can put them in your compost. So there are ways to use them. But yes, it's perfectly acceptable to put your starter in the fridge. You can go on vacation I've gone for up to 4 weeks and not fed it. And then some people say if you're going to keep it in the starter, you should at least take it out once a week. That's up to you. You can see how healthy your starter is. But you really, it is really pretty forgiving.
Great.
Okay.
One question Michelle had, I apologize, Michelle, that she's at sea level and was just curious if you need to make any alterations as far as the numbers and ratios if you are at sea level.
Nope, I haven't changed anything being at altitude. You can pay attention to if you're in a dry climate, if your starter starts to look different, you can hydrate it a little bit more, but I haven't really, it's pretty dry here. And this is a pretty standard formula for hydration. So this is considered 100% hydration because the flour and the water is 100% of the flour. They're equal amounts. And then just another thing just to bring up, if this occurred to anyone, well, why do I have to use this much flour and water? If I don't want to discard a bunch of my starter every time I feed it, why don't I just use less? What seems to be that there's, this optimal amount of flour and water that you need for the activity to happen, for your starter to be healthy. So and this actually comes from the sourdough school book, and she sees tons of sourdough starters, and they're very scientific and experimental. And she just says it comes down to experience, that she's noticed smaller amounts of starter spoil more easily. About 200 to 250 grams is an optimal amount for a home baker. And she said, I can't offer a scientific explanation for this, just many years of observation show that, that number is a critical mass for ideal microbial health.
Okay,
So that's on that.
Yeah, just scrolling down, you've spoken to this a fair amount, but just around the topic of temperature, Lauren just says that, they keep their house around 65, and she's read a lot about keeping things around room temperature, which can be closer to 70 to 75. They've been keeping the starter in the oven with the light on with 50-gram starter. Do you recommend doing that, or just keeping it 65, or doing less starter? Any other advice on temperature maintenance?
I mean, I think, you want to monitor the temperature just to be aware of what it is in your house, but it's not critical for you to make it warmer for the feeding of the starter. You actually want it cooler, so you have that longer 10 to 12 hour window to feed your starter. So your house at 65 is great. I know I hate that thing where it says room temperature, because that means different things for everybody. So that's why I really wanted to hone in on, you understanding that whatever your temperature is, here's how it's going to affect when you need to feed your starter. So let's see. So I would say a longer, cooler is better, so you can have longer time between feeds, so that a 2 times a day feed would get you feeding your starter at the optimal time. And so you would use, I would say, you don't need to keep it in the oven. 50 grams starter. I would say, you want to have I don't know if you're talking about this part in the recipe or the total amount, but if you lower your seed percentage, then it will take that longer window for it to ferment, so you feed it manageably. That make sense, Lauren? Lauren, you can unmute if you want, if you're still there.
That makes sense. Thanks, Mona.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Nice to see you.
Yes, you too.
And along that same subject line, what is the temperature range for water is the question.
So, when I want to get this nice long 10 to 12 hour time between feeds, you want to go as cool as you can. So I just use the temperature that comes out of my filtered water, which is something like 60. So cooler. You don't want to have, not for the feeding part, when you want to speed things up to get ready for, to build your leavon for your bake, and you want to know that it's strong and ready, so you want to control the time that happens in, then you would increase the temperature of the water. But cooler is better for that long 10 to 12 hour span between feeds.
Okay, great. A listener by the name of Hanukkah Roll is asking, they're saying that they are using 100% whole wheat ancient grain, following a Food Geek recipe carefully. Dough is like peanut butter consistency, horrible to work with, and barely rising in the banneton afterwards. What do you think is going wrong?
Let me see if I can use my Grain Lady powers. Hannah, is it einkorn that you're using?
Yes.
Aha! Okay, this is the separate question, but einkorn, I'll just give you a quick answer, behaves differently than all the other grains. It has gluten, but a different kind of gluten. So it does not perform well as a boule style bread. Not great for your starter either. It's kind of cockamamie, but awesome for cakes, for cookies. Percentage in bread, 10 to 20%, or as a loaf pan, you can use 100%, but you just need the structure of that loaf pan. It won't work in your proofing basket and as a boule shape. But don't despair. It's so flavorful. It's so great in any kind of baked good that has a lot of butter in it. It has an excellent, excellent flavor.
Yeah, I just ordered 40 pounds because it was like the only thing I could find
Of grain or flour?
of ancient grain flour. Like the Jovial was out of stock everywhere. Yeah, so I just went to icorn.com.
Okay. Well, you should refrigerate that flour or freeze it if you can. I don't know what kind of, and just plug away. Make a bunch of cakes and cookies, and pancakes, and you can make the bread. You can make a loaf pan bread as well, but I would not recommend using it in your starter.
Okay. Will it work for pasta?
In a smaller percentage, because that whole like wacky cement kind of consistency, wet cement, that'll carry through to everything. So only smaller percentages, but the flavor is amazing.
So where do we get the turkey red wheat in quantity?
Where are you? In Lions?
Boulder, yeah.
Moxie is starting. They've already started a mill in North Boulder. So I would, you can go to my website. There's a bunch of resources, and I would recommend, if you can, for the freshest grain flour possible is to buy whole grain and get yourself a tabletop mill, like a mock mill. Yeah. And then you can easily store the wheat berries in containers somewhere cool for an extended period of time, and then you just mill what you need when you need it. So that's the freshest way to go, the most nutrients. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, that's great. Yeah, there's been a couple questions about just maybe if you can't access turkey red, maybe if you're not near Moxie or you don't have freshly milled whole wheat flour, do you have any other recommendations of other kinds of flour to maybe seek out?
There's lots of great resources all over the country, lots of great millers, and you can find all that on my website under the resources, places where you can mail order. But local is best if you can access, if you can talk to your growers. Just it really depends where you are, but as close as you can get to sort of support that local food chain, that's the best way to go. So your own mill and getting the grain. Tap into your bakers. They're a great source for finding these sources of grains and flour.
Okay, and a troubleshooting question. Mike D wrote, my starter got a funky smell, not terrible, but funky for sure. I fed it a few more times and it smells fine again. Is that okay, or should I start over?
No, I think it's great. Just feed it regularly, and it really is resilient. So I don't think you need to start over, but you just have to observe it and see if it smells good and it's got bubbles and it's rising and falling consistently, then you should be just fine.
Okay. And another troubleshooting question. Martha wrote, I usually make my starter to put back in the fridge with starter. This morning I forgot to when I made my leavon. Can I make my new starter to put in the fridge from my leavon when I build dough in an hour?
Yes.
Okay.
I used to be sort of, so, there's this other thing that I'll just, if it wasn't clear, I'll just say it now, is that you always, when you go to bake something or to feed your starter, obviously you always have to save a small part of it to feed it again. And so what she's saying is I used to do this, what she did. Because I was like worried that I would accidentally that I would forget to save the seed amount to feed it. I used to save the starter from the morning or just feed that and then build my leavon to bake and then just discard that just in case as like a backup plan. But now what I do is I just build my leavon for the bake, and then Martha, I just save the seed percentage from that leavon and feed it, and that's my starter. Okay, so yes, you can start over.
Well, we are just continuing to have questions roll in, so I'll just keep them coming to you. Eric was asking just if you have another name for sourdough, just because sometimes he uses the name wild yeast bread just because sometimes folks assume that it's going to be very sour. Do you have another way of just kind of branding the idea of sourdough or any other alternative names for it?
You can say it's naturally leavened. That's
Yeah.
another thing that people say. Eric, I think you should come up with a name.
Very
I
nice.
like wild yeast bread.
Yeah.
I think everyone can take a vote. I like that. You could call it my wild bread, my wild and crazy bread, like Steve Martin or something.
Yeah, living bread or something.
Yeah.
Kindle's
Yes, you're
asking.
right. I don't even taste sour anymore. It's funny. My palate has changed so much. I don't think my bread is particularly sour, and maybe that's just because I like the flavor. But that's a whole nother conversation about, how to manage how sour your dough is. Okay.
Kindle is asking if there's an advantage to storing the starter in glass versus plastic containers.
These containers are, I'm pretty sure they're BPA free. I know the bigger ones that I have they're made in the USA. So if that's your one concern, there's that. These are easier to clean. And I do think that, I don't know, without the lid on, if you kept the lid on, this thick plastic seems to regulate the temperature a little bit better. But that's more with bread dough. Like I do my bread dough in bigger versions of these. So it's really just personal preference. The wide mouth for me is huge. The being able to clean it more easily. And I don't clean it every day. I only clean it really when it really gets kind of guppy. And even then, like when it gets too dry and flake, but see how dirty? And it's not dirty, but it's not perfectly clean because it does get caked up on the side when you're stirring it.
Okay, I'll ask 2 questions in one here. Sounds like Katie's starter has developed a sort of skin. Is that normal or a sign of hydration issue? And then Adam was asking, does it make a difference if you use filtered tap water or bottled water?
Okay. Katie, I kind of need some more information. I think it can be normal for, I don't know where you are in the process or how often you're feeding it or how hydrated, so it's a little bit hard to. You want to give me a little more information? No? Let me just.
She wrote that it was during the first few days.
Yeah, so that's normal. That's fine. Yep. And then, not having chlorine in the water is the best. You don't have to use bottled water. So filtered is great, or you can leave your water out, to let it settle. But you can also, the water is important, but if you don't have a ton of control over that, then just do the best you can. Nana, you want to talk about einkorn?
Einkorn?
Yes.
Oh, sure, I can talk about einkorn. Yeah, so I keep a starter of einkorn. I only bake with einkorn starter for now, and it works very well. And it actually, it just develops this high percentage of lactobacillus flavor in the breads and in the crackers. So the only thing is that one should not have an expectation of a fluffy bread. Einkorn just doesn't have the structure, but if you combine it with other flours, even if it's in a bread with a third, turkey red and a third einkorn and a third blue corn flour, it works very well. I do make a levain. So after the starter, I develop a levain with the einkorn, and I take at least 24 hours for the whole process, if not 40 hours for the whole process. And yet these breads don't get very sour either. They're lovely, large loaves. They don't have, a large lift, but they are very much European loaves the way I grew up with.
But for a beginner, probably best to start with a whole wheat starter, or not an einkorn starter.
I think whatever people have right now, I think everything. When you just make it trial and error. If somebody seems like has just ordered a lot of einkorn, then I would just start with einkorn, because if you have a large amount, then it's right now it's a particular situation. You don't want to just wait until you get the other flour. But yeah, for sure. Whatever is the preference and what's available, I think is a big question.
Great. Okay, we could probably do one more question.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's see here. We had a question about from Joan. My friend thought her starter was ready, but the bread didn't rise well. How do you know when it is ready for the first timers out there?
Okay, well that's the observation part. That's the seeing how much it rises, looking for the dome, looking for the bubbles and things like that. So that's just and smelling your starter, and making sure that you're feeding it regularly and it is rising and falling in a predictable way, and you are getting this activity, these bubbles. And it could have been other things too. So Joan, maybe that's a bigger question about why the bread didn't rise well. Yes, it has to do with the starter, but there are also other variables that could have affected why it didn't rise well. Okay. And Katie, I was pretty much done. I mean, I was done with my presentation. So that, I hope this was useful. It's a big topic, but you can just jump right in and start feeding it, follow the recipe, use a little bit of your science and observation skills and your taste buds. And whatever you make, it's always going to taste really good, even if it doesn't necessarily look the way you hoped it looked in the beginning. So I would say get in there, get in the kitchen. If you have any more questions, you can reach out to me. You can contact me through my website, thegrainlady.com. I'm sort of throwing around the idea of setting up a Grain Lady hotline of sorts, where you could have me at your disposal for a couple of weeks to ask me any questions particular to what you're doing. And so if that sounds interesting, or if you have any other thoughts on how we can work through this, just reach out to me via the website, and there'll be more of these through the Colorado Grain Chain and RMFU. And I think that's all. Thanks so much. I'm just super excited you're all baking.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other thing that that Kim mentioned on the chat too. The Colorado Grain Chain website will post all of their business members who have grain to purchase if folks are having trouble accessing that, and then also there'll be ways to access this information and information in the future.
Yep, great.
Well, we greatly appreciate it, Mona. Thank you so much for the time and expertise.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. And no April Fool's joke today. I couldn't come up with anything good. But happy April, and get outside. I'm going to go out to my garden after this and do the other thing that I love to do, plant some seeds. I hope you all get outside today. Okay, if anyone wants to talk to me, I'll sit here for a second. Anybody that